Chapter 6, Sounds in the Darkness. The boys sat in the dark, eating their candy bars. This just made Scott thirsty. He had a bottle of water and almost opened it. But we might need this, he said to himself. If they were going to spend a whole night in the mine, they'd need water. They would also need warmer jackets. The cold in the mine seeped into their bones. It was damp. Their feet were wet. The air was freezing. You know what I think? Scott asked. What? I think it's going to be a long, cold night. Yeah, Rico replied. He pounded his arms, trying to make his blood run faster. Then he had an idea. You still have that little light on your keychain? The simple truth came like a slap. Yeah, Scott replied. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and there was the light. He flicked it on. It wasn't much light in the dark tunnel. It barely lit up their faces and hands, but it was better than total darkness. Okay, turn it off, Rico ordered. That's all the light we have. We'd better save it, just in case. So you think we should just sit here? Scott asked. Yeah, Rico told him. I think we're dead lost. I think your map missed a couple of things. And I think we should have marked our way back out. Pretty stupid, eh? Scott sighed. It was pretty stupid. They hadn't been ready to go into the mine. They didn't have a plan in case they got lost. They'd been stupid. So they sat on a stone ledge, staring into the blackness. In the distance, they could hear water dripping. Sometimes there was the sound of wings. Bats, Scott thought, and began to shake. What time is it? Scott asked. Rico pushed the button on his watch. 7:30. We're missing Family Guy, Scott said. Yeah, Rico agreed, and we're missing dinner, too. Which do you miss more? Family Guy, Scott replied. My dad can't cook to save his life. Again, the two boys fell into silence. The gloom was too much, the damp air too cold. They tried to act like they'd be found in the morning, but both of them knew that the odds were lousy. They might be down here for days. They might die, lost in Bolton's mine. Chunk, chunk, chunk. What's that? Scott asked. Could be my stomach, Rico told him. I'm starving. No, listen. Chunk, chunk, chunk. It sounds like digging, Rico whispered. Do you think it's... Shh. For the first time in an hour, the boys felt hope. There was someone else down in the mine. There was someone, not too far away, digging. It's got to be Clay, Scott blurted out. Shh, Rico repeated. Scott turned on his keychain flashlight. Then both boys got to their feet and began to move toward the sound. They moved slowly. It was hard to see the tunnel floor and dark to follow the sound. And hard to follow the sound. The chunk, chunk, chunk came like an echo from all sides. But soon the boys found the spot where the three tunnels split off. They had a choice. Hey, we can get out of here, Scott said. Or we can stop Clay from stealing the treasure, Rico replied. In the darkness, they had to choose. Turn right, run out and reach the warm night air, or turn left, follow the tunnel and deal with Clay. For a second, the choice hung between them. It was like a question, waiting for an answer. They made up their minds at the same moment. Let's go see what he found, Rico said. I'm right behind you, Scott agreed. The two boys turned left. Now they had to be very quiet. The chunk, chunk, chunk was getting louder. Scott knew from the map that they were only a short way from the treasure, only a short way from Clay Prentice. They kept moving forward. Sometimes they'd bump into each other, but they said nothing. At last, in the distance, they saw a light. Scott flipped off his tiny flashlight. They walked slowly toward the light at the end of the tunnel. When they got to the end, they saw him. Clay was in the first big mining room. He had two lights aimed at the stones, and he was digging. There was sweat dripping off his forehead. His hands were covered with dirt. Chunk, chunk, clang! Clay's shovel had hit something. He began digging faster. More and more dirt came out and up. It made a little pile beside Clay on the mine floor. Got it, Clay said, talking to himself. He pushed the shovel down into the hole. Then he leaned hard on the shovel handle. Nothing happened. Clay swore and began digging more dirt. Scott wanted to say something. He wanted to tell Rico that Clay had found the treasure, but he couldn't speak. One word and Clay would know they were there. Clay pushed the shovel down again, leaning hard on the handle. Something began to lift up from the hole. Clay bent over and pulled at something heavy. At first, it still seemed stuck in the ground, but then something came free. In a few seconds, an old metal chest was on the floor of the mine. Clay picked up one of his lights and looked closely. There was an old lock on one side that held it closed. Clay picked up the shovel and stuck the tip into the lock. Then he pulled back on the handle until the lock snapped. Scott and Rico held their breath as Clay opened the box. "Well, look at that," Clay said out loud.